Recently, the FNaF movie came out and surprised absolutely no one. I loved it. I mean, I kinda expected to going in, but even UhYeah and the baddest, who I went with, were not only pleasantly surprised, they were completely blown away. I also went with Pastra and David Barron, and between all of us, it's hard to say which of us ended up liking the movie the most. But you know who didn't like it? Critics. And when I say they didn't like it, I mean they hated it. Somehow, the Five Nights at Freddy's movie has a lower critic score than both the Banana Splits movie and Willy's Wonderland, two movies that were made to bank off the success of the FNaF game series, both of which came as a result of the FNaF production's constant changing of hands. Now, to be fair, Willy's Wonderland is genuinely a very fun movie, in part because its lead is Nick fucking Cage, and in part because he doesn't speak a single word of dialogue in the whole movie. But Banana Splits? Seriously? Which is why I'm making this video now. Join me as I read through some of the worst critic reviews of the FNaF movie. But first, what qualifies a bad critic review? Well, I don't want it to come off as just any review of the film where the critic didn't like it. That's totally fair, but as a critic, you have to separate yourself from general audiences and analyze a film in the most objective light you can. It's because of this, most people I know at least tend to not care what critics have to say, because they're hardly, if ever, indicative of what a common filmgoer is really going to think of a movie. So a bad critic review would be one that does not achieve this separation. They either get too personal, or worse, they fail to be objective. If something is just factually wrong, that's a bad review. So keep that in mind while we read. Let's start with one that was shared around a lot on the 26th. One UhYeah actually read out loud to us while we were staying with him before we ever saw the movie that night. The animatronic bots may remind you of mangy puppets, but I don't remember Kermit the Frog ever opening his mechanized maw and chewing up someone's face Saw style. Now, there's just so much wrong with this review. I hardly know where to begin. I think the main thing with this review is it sounds like the critic bought a ticket without ever knowing what a Freddy Fazbear even was. Like, he didn't even know it was gonna be a horror movie. This is probably one of the most egregious examples of a critic failing to judge a movie objectively. This critic, who I will not name, basically just said, "I don't like the premise, so this movie is bad." And this is someone who is allowed to affect the critic score of the movie. Give me a break. Being honest as well, I do understand that maybe this guy expected the film to be more lighthearted than it was, which is very ironic given a theme among some of the other reviews, which claim the film isn't scary enough. I had to start with this one because it's pretty much universally known as being one of the worst, but now here's some you may not have heard before. Ample faithfulness to the source material alone doesn't help the property to stand on its own or to make sense. Jump scares and minimally creepy notions, it's only PG-13 after all, abound, but they can't single-handedly compose a movie. Now, this critic does bring up a fair point at first, that being that faithfulness to source material should not be the only merit by which a movie is judged, only to then completely undermine themselves by excusing the movie not being scary by saying it's PG-13. I'm sorry, hello? An age rating is not an indicator of how harshly you can treat a movie, especially a horror movie. You know what other horror films are PG-13? A Quiet Place, The Grudge, Insidious, Fire in the Sky. That one being PG-13 caught me so off guard, and if you've seen it, you'd know why. PG-13 is not necessarily an indicator that the horror is of lesser quality. Honestly, my main issue with this review is it sounds like the reviewer never gave the film much of a chance because they went in with the notion that it wouldn't be anything great because of its age rating. The game's original story is both intriguing and suitably horrifying. I have a daughter who fills in gaps for me. It involves missing children and an inventor whose good intentions go wrong. I like the story the game tells, I wish it were on the screen. This one puzzles me a lot because, like, what the fuck? This is criticizing the movie for not being a retelling of a story that does not exist. I really need to emphasize that this is someone who's able to influence the overall score of the movie. The FNaF games are never about an inventor whose good intentions go wrong. I mean, there is Edwin, but he's in the books only, so he doesn't count, shut up. Literally every single robot in the series was either made to kill people or be extremely cheap and profitable. And that's about as good as they get. So to complain that the movie is not a realization of that story is blaming it for not reading your mind and being exactly what you want it to be. I think this critic did have somewhat of the right idea though. This is a video game adaptation, so it makes sense to familiarize yourself with the game first. And to their credit, they kind of did that. Kind of. If this person can write a review of a movie and criticize it for not matching their fanfiction, despite having never played the games, then I could do the same. Titanic wasn't that good because I heard Jack comes back as Superman at the end and it didn't happen. Did I do it right, Rotten Tomatoes? Five Nights at Freddy's is somehow a slog to get through and will promptly be forgotten by morning. This one's just funny, for obvious reasons, like it being Blumhouse's biggest Halloween opening of all time, outdoing Halloween. Like, this movie was so big that it outdid the movie named after the holiday it orbits around. Now, maybe this critic was saying they would forget the movie in the morning, to which I say, sure, but like, that's just sad, man. When the Banana Splits got there first and did it slightly better, you're in trouble. Okay, this one genuinely got under my skin, and for reasons I mentioned at the top of this video. The Banana Splits movie was only really made because of Five Nights at Freddy's, to a point where even the obviously costumed mascot characters were written into the script to be animatronics. Now, if you enjoy the Banana Splits movie, that's your own headache, but to bring it up here under this movie, just comes across like the critic has no idea what he's talking about. The Banana Splits movie didn't get there first, it got there because it saw FNaF get there. As for calling it better, hey, that's subjective. But if you prefer the TikTok couple to Mike and Vanessa, I don't think I can look you in the eye. Expanding the game's simple, primal premise with a surfeit of character melodrama, it's a Five Nights at Freddy's that labors under the bizarre assumption that the loyal fanbase wants a lot of extraneous plot surrounding the fun center horror. This one had me smiling from ear to ear when I read it. I mean this in the nicest way possible, but brother, it is very obvious you have never met a FNaF fan. If anything, modern FNaF fans are annoyed there isn't more character melodrama. That's why every single theory now is about the ghost of a little blonde girl coming back. But this is really the first critique where I wanted to point out that critics can't decide if this movie has too much story or not enough. This person here clearly thinks that the FNaF movie is better off sticking to its guns with a security guard at Freddy's and avoiding overly characterizing or introducing drama to its human cast. Let's pair that critique with doesn't have much to say about its underlying subject matter besides, hey, wouldn't it be weird if those musical pizza robots came to life and had sharp teeth? This is another critique where I have to ask, did they walk out of the theater and just chill in the lobby for 2 hours until the movie was over? Doesn't have much to say about its underlying subject matter, and that's essentially everything the film is doing. It's saying. The subject matter is not just that the robots are creepy, it's a ghost story. But I'm not sure this critic even realizes that. One of my main praises of this movie is how much it allows the actual ghosts of the kids ample time to communicate and make themselves seen. This is probably one of the less egregious reviews, but I did feel it was worth arguing. This next one though, a story that could have worked so well in the hands of the best Tim Burton was left in the hands of the video game creator Scott Cawthon, who curated the script and the mise-en-scene. This is another one where it just seems like the critic wanted to watch a different movie. Bringing Tim Burton into this is just the most bizarre take to me. You're telling me that Tim Burton would have a better understanding of the source material than the guy who's been writing it for almost 10 years. You're telling me that Tim Burton would be better at bringing this movie to life than the guy who knows the DNA of this film like it was his own. And why Tim Burton? I mean, I like his films, yeah, but what? Were you planning on watching Sweeney Todd and accidentally walked into a theater showing FNaF? It's such an odd choice because the kind of horror Tim Burton is good at creating is more gothic horror, not Five Nights at Freddy's. This critique is just out there. Willy's Wonderland was a weak, predictable, dumb film, but at least it had Nicolas Cage. I got nothing really to say about this review except that it's just true, honest, respect. In the game, the players are Mike, and the goal is to not get killed. The pace is speedy, the threats are many. It's all about staying alive. The problem for the movie audience is staying awake. I picked this review for a couple reasons. First off, the snarkiness, and second, because critics love to pretend they know anything about what they're talking about here. The pace of FNaF is not speedy. It's a slow burn horror game where you have to wait for the threats to come to you. I mean, sure, the game can be speedy if you're playing 420 mode, but I'm willing to bet this reviewer has not played that. The second thing is that a lot of these critiques like to drill in some little snarky joke at the end. I can only imagine critics writing these things out, cracking their knuckles and saying, "Take that, Freddy Fazbear, I'm smarter than you and your general audiences." And like, no. To be honest, in a critique like this, I don't think there's any room for that kind of condescending or sarcastic humor, because it just makes the critic look like they aren't taking the review itself seriously, which to be fair, they probably didn't. But again, critic review. These are supposed to be reviews by people who know what they're talking about and can speak on it professionally. Dour and depressing, all about buried traumas and child endangerment in both the past and present. I mean, yeah. This is yet another one where it just seems like the critic did not realize what kind of movie they were watching before they sat down. This is a horror movie about dead kids. They even say this in the trailer. If you didn't like the sound of that, why did you sit down and watch the thing? But okay, is the movie depressing? No. Nothing about this movie brings even the thought of a tear to my eye, or really anyone's. But even then, it wouldn't really be a problem if it did. Have you ever felt good about yourself watching a Saw movie? Like Teletubbies with chainsaws or knife-wielding Fimbles, it's absurd, but not in a good way. This comes from one of Rotten Tomatoes' top critics. A top critic's review is that it reminded them of Teletubbies with chainsaws or knife-wielding Fimbles, and that it was absurd, but not in a good way. This review boggles me, in part because I hear Teletubbies with chainsaws and I think, oh man, that sounds crazy, that sounds fun. Like, it genuinely sounds like this guy would have been happier if the FNaF movie was just about normal animatronics and Mike was just working there as a security guard and nothing bad ever happened to anyone ever. I'm sorry, but that's just absurd and not in a good way. I hate singling out actors because bad movies are rarely their fault, but Hutcherson's terrible performance is right at home in this stuffed dog of a thriller. I saved this one for last because it's probably the review that I disagree with the most. As much as I love the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, I can't pretend that it would be even half as good without Hutcherson as the lead. Josh Hutcherson's interpretation of Mike took a character I hated and turned him into one I loved. As weird as it is, by the time I finished watching, my favorite character was not Bonnie or Foxy or any animatronic, it was Mike. I'm ending with this review because it's probably the most debatable, but it's not outright wrong. It's an opinion, how can it be? But it's an opinion I heavily disagree with. Another reason I picked it is more personal, but like, when did thriller become a bad word? Oh man, it's not a horror movie, it's a thriller movie. Like, no, horror movies and thriller movies are different genres. Usually I just hear the word thriller refer to horror movies that aren't scary. Stop that. Learn what a thriller is. And there you have it. The absolute worst I could find of FNaF movie critic reviews. Keep in mind that although these reviews are bad, there are those critics out there who are simply doing their job and doing it just fine. While looking over these reviews, I found plenty of negative reviews that I thought had plenty of good points and were well written. The ones I shared here, I shared because to me, they are the bottom of the barrel, the summations of what a bad critique is, and I hope you enjoyed me tearing into them. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.